The Terex AC200 is a crane in a 200 ton capacity class, and it's got a main boom extension of nearly 68 metres in length. It was first modelled by NZG in about 2003, and this review looks at the 2012 version. We'll look at two variations. Model 869 is in Terex colours, and Model 86903 is in the colours of Merkel, a German crane hire company. The packaging for both models is the same. They come in a Terex branded box, and interestingly the photo on the front is a 6-axle version of the crane rather than the 5-axle model contained in the box. The first thing you find when you open the box is a little bag containing a pair of cotton gloves, but there's no leaflet or information about the model. The two trays are factory sealed, and after you cut the tape you can lift the lid and you see the model is nicely wrapped. The first thing you notice when you get the model out is that it's really very heavy. It's nearly all made of metal, and it certainly has a solid feel to it. It comes largely assembled, and the only other parts in the box are a bag that contains the hook. There's another bag that has some pins and other small parts, and there is the fly jib which stows on the side of the main boom. One interesting inclusion with the model is the pair of cotton gloves, and these are really intended, I think, just to stop getting grease marks and so on onto the model. They fit well, they look quite nice. In fact, they could be this year's latest fashion item. Well, perhaps not. Unusually for NZG, there were a couple of defects on review models. The Terex version was missing some chevron graphics on an outrigger post. The Merkel version had some quite bad paint damage, which I've painted over for the review, but these problems need to be sorted out by the dealer. Let's look first at what was in the bags. There is the hook, there are a couple of keys for using to wind the winch, two small pins for the fold-away jib and some bigger ones to fit the fly jib on, some spare boom locks and something to help reeve the model. For this stage of the assembly we'll prepare the model to display it in a transport mode, so the first thing you need to do is to take the counterweight off, which is fixed on in the factory, and that's just a matter of undoing the two silver bolts which hold it on. You need to rotate the crane to be able to drop the counterweight off. You see that leaves one counterweight slab left on, and that's not easily removable, but if you unwind some thread it might be possible to undo the screws that hold it on. The outrigger pads are already on and they don't really look right for road transport, so it's best just to remove those, and it's just a matter of simply unscrewing them. And then you need to add on the fly jib, and that goes on with the fold-away section on the inside, and you can just put that and rest it on the boom supports. That just leaves the hook, and if you want you could just stow it behind the cab, although a big hook like that might normally go on a ballast carrier, and then the crane's ready for the road. There is another option, which is to reeve the hook block and attach it at the front, but it just looks a bit too big. Underneath the model there's really no detailing, it's just purely functional, but it is interesting to see that NZG have updated the casting to have this model number of 869. The tyres are pretty good with a decent tread pattern, and there's some variation in the metal wheel design between the front and other axles. The cab looks pretty good with mirrors and wipers, and the lights at the front have been replicated by the means of paint. Behind the cab there are some textured surfaces and some equipment is detailed, and there's no beacon lights on this version of the model. The outrigger beams are metal, and as you might expect from an older model, the pistons are screw threads. The look of the crane cab has been much improved on this latest version of the model, with the window sills and framing visible. The rest of the crane body is fairly simple, with some textured walkways and metal handrails. At the rear the counterweight looks okay, but it's not been modelled in the authentic pieces of the real machine. One improvement on this revision of the model is the separate metal pulleys, and these are much better. At the boom head the graphics look good and the big hook matches well. The fly jib is a metal part, the lattice work is good, and perhaps only the pulley at the end would have been better if it had been black rather than brass. The Merkel version of the crane is almost exactly the same as the Terex version, except it has beacon lights on the driving cab. It looks really nice in its colour scheme. In particular, the graphics are high quality and they look very sharp. There's no doubt this version of the model looks very good, and it's rarer too, with only 300 being made in a limited edition. We'll start with the crane in transport mode, and one of the ways you can display the model is if you've got a suitable ballast carrier you can add various parts onto that. So here we're adding the two sections of counterweight and the hook, and you can also add the pads if you want. And that can produce a pretty good looking display for the model if you haven't got space to build the crane up. Moving on to the crane in detail, we'll start underneath, and the rear and front pairs of axles steer and they're linked together, and have got a reasonable range of movement, but there's no steering at all on the central axle. And when it's the right way up, it rolls well in a straight line. It's a big heavy model, but it rolls well. And if you set the steering on the front and rear pairs of axles, it can replicate turning in a sharp bend very well and traces out a realistic looking arc. To set the crane up, we need to fix the outrigger pads back into the beams, and they just pull out, and then you can just lower the pads by unscrewing. They're strong enough to hold the weight of the crane, and if you like you can add some pads which are separately available as NZG part number 7871. The real crane would normally set its own counterweight up by loading it onto the mid-deck position on the carrier, and then swinging around to attach it. And you can kind of replicate that on the model because there are a couple of points on the carrier deck where the counterweight slots into, and if you put that into position it just goes into more or less the right place. And then if you add the rest on, you can then pose the model as if it had loaded its own counterweight. It's not been fully modelled accurately, however, because you can't now turn the crane round and set it up over the counterweight as if it was then going to be attached, because it clashes, but that's really a minor point. So to attach the counterweight you just need to turn the crane round and then use the two screwed connectors to just tighten them up and hold the counterweight in place. And as long as they're done up tightly, then all the tolerances work, because the crane now can be fully rotated and the counterweight is clear of the carrier. So we'll decide to go large and add the fly jib on. It just rests on the side of the boom, which does mean that when the boom is raised, the fly jib will slip off if it's not attached, so you can't really pose it that way. But anyway, we'll attach the fly jib and it just pins into place. And because there are no pulleys at the end of the lattice section, you have to open up the swing away part. And if any of the pin connections are tight, then just use a screwdriver just to ream off some of the paint inside the holes, and then the pin should just slot in reasonably easily. With the fly jib on, we can reeve up the hook, and so the first thing to do is to unwind some thread, and there's a little tool that's used to turn the winch, and that just works really quite easily. At the other end, the hook is waiting. It's quite a good part because the hook rotates from the block and there's a little tie-off point at the top, and all the pulleys are separate. But it's really too large a hook block to go on the end of the fly jib, but it's all we've got, so we'll just tie that on. Even if you hang it off the main boom, this is a very easy hook to reeve, and once you've got it all tied up, you can then just snip the end off to make it look a bit neater. The next step is to raise the boom, and for this you actually need some muscles. The first stage is not too bad, it can lift up reasonably well, but the final part is very stiff and don't take the boom cylinder beyond a vertical position. With the boom up you can rotate the crane, which is quite a tight mechanism, and that's good because at least there's no rocking at all in the crane. Let's now have a go at testing the winch, and we just apply the tool to the end of the winch drum. And by turning it we can lower the hook, and there's enough friction in the drum to hold the hook in place. Of course it's a telescopic crane, so we can extend the boom, and this one's got many sections, and they just pull out quite smoothly, and they have a locking system which locks each piece in place when it's fully extended. And if you look carefully you can just see that the locking pin engages. At full extension, a big model results. It's about 1.7 meters high. And because there's a little bit of flexibility in the boom sections, you need to adjust it so that it doesn't lean sideways a little. One other feature is the tilting operator's cab, which has got a small amount of movement, but it will hold the pose. To finish up with, there are a couple of tips. One is when you raise the boom to its maximum angle, you have to be a little bit careful when the cylinder gets to vertical because, it can just pop out. And secondly, when you're closing the boom up, because it's such a stiff connection, you need to support the boom cylinder because otherwise it may well buckle under the pressure that you're applying to try to lower the boom. In summary, the AC200 has been around a long time, but the latest revision does improve it further. You get a 5-axle crane with a lot of metal, and it's reasonably priced, and overall it's good enough to be recommended.